I'm joined today on the ACS Cricket Podcast by Peter Handford, Emeritus Professor at the University of Western Australia's School of Law, cricket historian and scorer, and most pertinent, perhaps for our purposes, a founding member of the Association of Cricket Statisticians and Historians. I'd like to begin with your love affair with cricket, the game and its law, and indeed with scoring. How did you get started?
At school, not being quite good enough to play for the team, I offered my services as a scorer. And I scored for the school team for 3 years. And in the second of those years, which would be 1964, the talent scout from the Warwickshire Young Amateurs came around. Now, this was effectively the county under-19 team, and he was looking for potential players. And while he was at it, he recruited me as a scorer. So within a week or two, I was scoring for the Warwickshire Young Amateurs, who played about 3 weeks' worth of matches against equivalent sides from the other counties. And before long, I was scoring in a match between the North and the South. I've been looking back at some old scorecards. For example, in that match, Ray East of Essex played for one side and Frank Hayes of Lancashire and England played for the other. So Warwickshire Young Amateurs, in time, I became known as somebody who was available to score. A season or two later, perhaps, I was scoring for the Warwickshire Old County Cricketers 11, who played a few matches, and there are some stories to be told there. Obviously, this enabled me to see people who had retired before I had really got to know them. People like Eric Hollis played and told a story that I may get round to telling you. The Midlands Club Cricket Conference, Warwickshire Club and Ground. And then in 1967, I was on standby to score for the Warwickshire second 11 because the Warwickshire scorer had not been well. But around about the time I finished my university exams, he came back on duty. So I thought, well, that's the end of that. But round about the beginning of August, I got a phone call to say that he'd had a heart attack and died on the job, as it were. So I was summoned to score for Warwickshire in the third day of a match against Scotland. And from that point onwards, I was the Warwickshire second 11 scorer. Within a day or two, I was off to Cumberland and Durham. And for 5 years, for most of the season, I was Warwickshire second 11 scorer from 67 to 71. And this led to invitations to score. First, I suppose, for the rest of the world against England in 1970. The home ground authority had to provide a scorer for the rest of the world. England had a scorer who was scoring for the whole of the season. So they offered that to me, which was very nice of them because there was a county scorer, but who normally got test matches. But I got this one. 1971, the Indians needed a scorer. I scored for them against Warwickshire because I'd had a couple of years at Cambridge, 1969 and 1970. I knew some of the players and I went on the tour with them when they started to play away matches, and I scored in 2 varsity matches. They were playing Derek Robbins 11 in 1970. Do you know about Derek Robbins? Had an 11 who played matches in England, some of which were first class, and especially during the period of isolation, he ran tours to South Africa. So he invited me to go and score for him and do some other things, and I went down to Eastbourne, where most of those matches were played, and scored down there. End of 1971, I'd pretty much retired. I was a full-time university teacher by then, and it was just incompatible with that to spend very much time pursuing my hobby, I suppose. It really was. So that came to an end. The Warwickshire connection came to an end in 1971. But Leslie Deakins, who was the Warwickshire secretary, put forward my name to the BBC, who needed a scorer for BBC radio broadcasting county cricket. So that was 1972 to 1976, travelling around the Midlands area on a number of Saturdays during the season, working with various commentators. Also in 1973, I was sitting in my office in Leicester University when I got a call from Edgbaston saying, SOS, there's a test match starting tomorrow and the scorer for England would normally be the Warwickshire scorer, Philip Pike, but he's marooned in Cardiff with gastroenteritis. So can you please come and score for England? So I did, and that was my one and only test match, but memorable, if only because one of the umpires went on strike. Along with all this, I forget exactly when, but sometime in the late 60s, Leslie Deakins, again, the Warwickshire secretary, invited me to become responsible for the club library and later on the museum. I actually knew, since age 10, I was reading every cricket book I could find. My interest was awakened probably by the fact we'd acquired a television and the Australians were playing in England in 1956. I'd been interested before, but that's when I really got interested and read every cricket book in the local library and carried on reading. In fact, it must have been in 1958, I was still at junior school and I got sent out of the room for some misdemeanor or other, which didn't happen that often, but I was told to take a book and go and read it in the library. I remember I was reading a book called History of Cricket by Eric Parker, which was about 2 inches thick, which is probably unusual for an 11-year-old child to read. So I was reading quite a lot. And I learnt a lot more. Warwickshire had this marvellous collection of books donated to it up until, I don't know whether the donation or the donor died, but pretty nearly every cricket book published up to that time he seemed to have collected. So it was a basis for a fantastic library. And I'd actually run quite a big library at school, so I knew something about cataloguing. We catalogued it and turned it into a library. I spent lots of happy hours working with these books at Edgbaston and later on with the club museum and all the photographs and the artifacts that we had. I'll tell you one little story. You may well have heard of Sam Hargreaves, who was a left-arm slow bowler for Warwickshire in the 1890s. Probably about number 3 in the country after Rhodes and Blythe. And we had the ball in the museum with which he took 15 wickets against, I forget whom, maybe Surrey. But subsequently, this ball had been owned by Jack Hobbs. I don't quite know why. And he passed it to a friend of his called Ted Hampton, who was the Warwickshire statistician. And it had finished up in the museum. And I was reading this book by Jack Hobbs, written about 1930, and he was describing this ball, and I thought, I have had that ball in my hands. So we had things like that. So that was the museum. All this came to an end really at the end of 1976, because in 1977 I'd earned study leave at the university and I determined to spend the year in Australia where I could teach for a whole academic year. So in 1977 I came out to Western Australia, flew out during the centenary test match, as a matter of fact. And while I was in Australia, I was offered a permanent job. I had a family by then, and it seemed like this was the way of the future. So that's when, 1978 is when I moved to Australia. All my scoring connections came to an end, most of my museum and library connections, but I did remain as a sort of consultant for quite a long time. And on visits to the UK, I would usually spend a day or two at the library, but eventually that came to an end in due course too. So it was all really ancient history, but it was quite an interesting few years.
Having discussed your early years, perhaps we should say a bit about the early years of the ACS. Tell us a bit about the foundation of this venerable institution.
Okay, I must have got in touch with Robert Brooke at some time or another. He was around in Warwickshire, and I just cannot remember exactly how I first came across him. I thought I had some letters from Rob, and I certainly do have one about his book that he was writing on John Shilton, the early Warwickshire bowler. Rob discovered all sorts of things about him, how he had stolen the identity of another person and so on. It's a fascinating read. I don't think that was the first letter I had from him, but we sort of became known to each other. And in 1973, by which time I was doing this occasional work for the BBC, but I had finished other sorts of scoring. But Rob communicated with a number of people saying he was getting together a group or thinking of forming a society because he felt that cricket statistics needed perhaps not exactly recognition, but it was time for statisticians to start working together rather than just on their own, working as a group, and that there was lots of work to do. There was still quite a lot of uncertainty and difference in those days as to what a first-class match was, and many other things like that. So a meeting was convened at Edgbaston by Rob Brooke and Dennis Lambert, who's now dead. I think they conceived the idea in a pub in Warwickshire, in a place called Aston Cantlow. There is a history of the ACS, and it was written some years later, about 20 years later, and the origins are reviewed. But people like me got this letter, and 30 or so people came to the original meeting, and the pros and cons of debating a separate association were forming a separate association were debated, and there was quite a lot of opposition from Irving Rosenwater, who was then standing very high in this business. He did a lot of scoring work for radio, TV. He was a noted authority either then or later. He wrote probably one of the best biographies of Sir Donald Bradman. I had met him actually during that test match in 1970 when he and Eddie Solomon, who was the England scorer, were debating whether it was an official test match or not. Anyway, Irving Rosenwater, there was something called the Cricket Society, and I think I belonged to that at some point, certainly belonged at some point. And Irving was putting the view that this should all be done through the Cricket Society, rather than by forming a separate association. Other people were championing a different view, and eventually it was put to the vote. And I think by one vote, it was decided to form a separate society. So Rob went ahead and formed the society a month or two afterwards, and most of the people, probably all the people in that original meeting, joined and became original members. And I was probably the youngest of them. I was still in my 20s. Most of them were quite a bit older than that. Back in those days, there were people who were saying things like Bill Frindle's record book isn't necessarily quite accurate and 100% complete. There were people used to go on about the views of other statisticians, but Bill Frindle certainly joined, and most of the noted statisticians of the day, the people who were Michael Fordham, for example. And I think Irving Rosenwater eventually joined, yes, probably because the journal started. It was a fairly humble affair to start off with. The first one is just about 4 pages stapled together. I think, have all of them, and it became, the very polished journal that you've probably been subscribing for years, and all the later issues, but the early ones were a bit more rudimentary.
It sounds as if in the early days of the ACS, it was strictly the ACS, the Association of Cricket Statisticians, whereas today its historical output arguably is even more to the fore. The Lives in Cricket series is hugely successful. The contributions in socio-political history of the likes of Eric Midwinter, Pathbreaking. When do you think that emphasis came in? When did it begin to shift or to change?
Not sure exactly when, but that was certainly a later edition. The journal, excuse me, is the journal's never changed its title, but it originally was the Association of Cricket Statisticians, and it'd be possible to look up perhaps that history that is sitting on a shelf up there somewhere might tell me, maybe about 20 years later. But of course it widens its brief. But the important early work, I should perhaps say, I went to perhaps the first 3 or 4 meetings while I was still based in England, say 73 to 76. But after that, I was unable to go to any meetings because I was in Australia. And until these Zoom meetings of recent years, I haven't been able to attend any meetings in any form. But I've kept on reading the journal, and I have written occasional articles. But I can't tell you much else about. I can remember the early meetings. I can remember some of the debates, some of the people, many of whom are now deceased, unfortunately. And this is what I was going to say. In many ways, the most important work the association has done was done in the early years because they did extensive research on what was a first-class match and producing a recognised list of what matches were first class and which weren't. And there were a number of publications devoted to first-class cricket in each country, moving towards setting out a defined list. And in many ways, that work was completed just a year ago when Wisden, as you probably know, went over to the ACS figures. So Jack Hobbs hasn't any longer scored 197 centuries, it's 199. And W.G. Grace has been deprived of a couple of centuries, and his 100th was not, in fact, his 100th, and so on. I don't think it matters. I think I suggested at some point I might have contacted someone like Harriet Monkhouse and said, you can have footnotes to the records that explain these differences. But I think it's quite something that, well, for example, the idea of a List A match is one that was invented by the ACS and is now recognised. That Wisden, after many years of opposition, and Wisden, for example, for many years recognising the rest of the world matches in 1970 as tests, then repented and decided that they weren't. And now, as I say, it's gone over to the ACS figures, so there's no longer difference about that. And I think that recognises the status of the ACS, also that it's been consulted on things like rule changes and all those sorts of things. People like David Kendix sit on important committees. So it's 50 years of very notable achievement, I think, really.
Very good, thank you. Having led such an interesting and varied life in cricket and cricketana and cricket broadcasting and scoring and law, you must have encountered a variety of very interesting people. I believe you mentioned Tiger Smith to me, and his reminiscences of the 1911-12 tour, I think you said.
Well, let's start with him. He, of course, as I'm sure you know, played for Warwickshire before and after the First World War, and in fact played for England before the First World War. He went on this famous 1911-12 tour with Hobson Rhodes opening the batting, and so I'll just let that ring. It's somebody I don't want to know. Barnes and Foster opening the bowling, of course, and Foster was the Warwickshire captain. And as I understand it, Smith was the number 2 keeper, but he kept in 4 of the tests because he could keep to Foster's left arm bowling better than Strudwick. He was probably a better batsman too. Anyway, he played for Warwickshire after the war. Then he was a first class and test umpire in the 1930s and Warwickshire coach in the 1940s. And I came across him in the 1960s, I suppose. Actually, must first have come. When I was at university, we were supposed to do physical activity one afternoon a week, and I used to bowl in the indoor school, bat and bowl in the indoor school at Warwickshire, and he was in charge there, but I didn't fully know who he was then. But a year or two afterwards, when I was scoring, I got to know him because he remained remarkably acute into his 90s, and he would sit. He had a position in the front of the dining room in the pavilion at Edgbaston. He would be there for every match, and people like Dennis Amiss would consult him if they felt they were doing something wrong, and he would say, your top hand's not quite in the right place or something like that. But at some point, well, two things happened, and I'll come to the second one in a moment. But the talk I remember having with him was at some point when I was scoring and had an opportunity to talk to him for a while. So I asked him about the 1911-12 tour and all these famous players. And the thing I remember, I asked him about Sidney Barnes, and I said to him, well, what did Barnes do that he was such a special bowler? And he said, it's not really so much what he did, it's what he made the batsman think he was doing. Because Barnes, as I understand it, bowled at a pretty brisk pace, but he spun the ball as much as anything. And no doubt it swerved in the air and spun both ways and things like that. But he seems to have been quite remarkable in the number of wickets he took per test, which is quite exceptional. I think he has 189 wickets from 40 odd. And of course, he wasn't a regular county player for most of this time. He was too busy earning money in the leagues. The other experience with Tiger Smith was that in my museum and library function, we were busy collecting team photographs. We were trying to have a team photograph of Warwickshire for every year. And we had been donated a number of team photographs, and we had some from the first decade of the 20th century, and we needed to fill in some names. So Leslie Deakins arranged that we would go round to see Tiger Smith at his home, and he was able to fill in the blanks, and he would say things like, this was taken at Old Trafford and so on. He had a remarkable memory in old age for names and faces and places. And I remember we were talking, and he asked me to get up and demonstrate how I would play an on drive. And he then told me what I was doing wrong. So, you know, one remembers conversations like this, and he would be obviously the most senior player I met by quite a way. But in the course of doing one thing or another, I can remember coming across people like, I was working in the press box at a test match in Edgbaston, liaising with the scorers. And in the press box were people like Keith Miller, Frank Tyson, Leary Constantine. I remember at least speaking for a short time to each of those. Trevor Bailey, I remember, was around probably doing the BBC radio thing when I was scoring for England against the West Indies in 1973. That was the match as it was chiefly notable for the fact that one of the umpires went on strike. The umpires were Arthur Fagg, the old Kent player, and Dickie Bird, who was in his second test match. And something occurred. I think it was to do with Boycott being given not out. And Canhigh, the West Indian captain, was not pleased and said something to Arthur Fagg. And maybe there was more than that, but Arthur Fagg decided he'd had enough and he was going home and he wasn't coming out again. And play was held up for quite a while the umpire was on strike, and there were negotiations in the pavilion. Of course, I was there. Dickie Bird was very worried as well. He might be. What am I going to do? You know, that's right. And the story is probably told. I have two or three of them, but eventually play restarted and Dickie Bird came out, and the other umpire was Alan Oakman, the Warwickshire coach, who I knew quite well, former Sussex player, Sussex and England player, and he had been a first-class umpire for a season or so. So he was going to stand at square leg, and Dickie Bird was going to stand at the bowler's end throughout until they could find another umpire from somewhere or other. But after an over, Arthur Fagg decided he'd better come out, so he came out an over late. And there was a session of play after that in which the West Indies bowlers were being a little bad-tempered, and there was a very slow over rate. And after that, I think the umpires gave them a talking to, possibly gave both sides a talking to, and things then resumed in a more orthodox way. But I can't remember much else about that test match. I do have the scorecard somewhere. Here we are. Not really. No. Tony Gregg was Illingworth was the captain for England. Canhigh was the captain for West Indies. Roy Fredericks made 150, and I don't remember very much of it. That was five. I suppose it was so unusual that dominates my memory. But I didn't score right through. By about day 4. Philip Pike, the Warwickshire scorer, had been well enough to return from Cardiff, and so he was there, and he took over on day 5. And if you look at the final scorecard, they used to issue a completed scorecard with the full score on it. It has his name on it and not mine, which was a bit annoying. But my name was on all the scorecards up to and including day 4. So I reckon I did more of that match than he did. He was a good friend, Philip Pike. We did score a few matches together when Warwickshire played Cambridge University, for example. I was scoring for Cambridge and he was scoring for Warwickshire. About the only area I haven't said something about is the Warwickshire Old County Cricketers team. They played a few matches every year, and led by people like Peter Cranmer, who captained England at rugby before the war, and I knew him also. When I was working for BBC Radio, he was one of the commentators I worked with quite a lot, actually, along with Henry Blofeld, and he was an Alan Gibson. I did quite a lot with each of those three. I think it would be worth, yes, I mean, they were only county matches, and we were mainly reporting rather than broadcasting. But a few notable things. We were at Leicester when Glenn Turner was on the cusp of getting 1,000 runs in May, and it looked as though he wasn't going to do it because it rained. And there was a photograph in the Times somewhere of Glenn Turner under an umbrella looking out at a rainy Leicester. It was actually my umbrella that was borrowed for the purpose. But he did get his 1,000. He was able to get the necessary runs in the next match. Also, my first sight of David Gower, I remember that particularly, how much of an impression he made on me when he was playing against the West Indies in 1976. First I'd ever heard of him, but you could see he was a class act. But I was going to tell you briefly about the Warwickshire Old County Cricketers. Various people played. I remember particularly Eric Hollis, and I could tell the story that he told about one of the matches. They played the president of Warwickshire's 11. The president of Warwickshire was General Sir Oliver Leese, who was number 2 to Montgomery in North Africa. And he had this sort of country house ground on his estate. And the Warwickshire Old County Cricketers played his team every year. And they had a couple of trees within the boundary that were deemed boundaries if the ball hit the tree. And Eric Hollis told the story in more detail than this, but last over he bowled his googly, and the wicketkeeper, who was the stand-in wicketkeeper, didn't see it. The batsman, of course, didn't see it. It ran down, hit one of the trees. That was 4 runs, and the other side won the match. But Eric Hollis was a raconteur, inimitable. He would. I heard lots of stories about him. This I only know secondhand, but he phoned up Leslie Deakins from the Oval. This is when England were all out 52, and he said, "Did you see who was not out?" Which, of course, was Holly's number 11. He seemed to be as proud of that, actually, as bowling Bradman for a duck in that particular account anyway. But it was great to see him bowl. I think I just about had... I remember watching perhaps the first match at Edgbaston I went to might have been in 1956, right at the end of his career. But to see him and a few others play in these matches was quite something. And did I, in anything I've sent to you, tell you about Gordon Greenidge and his 273 not out at Eastbourne? This is one of the Derek Robbins matches, Derek Robbins and the West Indies. And it was actually a first-class match, and he just hit his 11th 6. And I looked it up and realised we were 2 away from a world record, so we sent the scoreboard operator off to inform the authorities in the pavilion. But by the time he got halfway around the ground, they declared. If the news had got through, they certainly wouldn't have done. And I got this mock serious telling off from Derek Robbins for not getting onto it sooner and sending the messages sooner than that. Greenwich didn't even know it was a first-class match. They had a big communal bath at Eastbourne. I remember him doing a double somersault in the bath when he said, was this first class? And somebody said yes. So he didn't realise he'd got, probably was his highest score, 273 not out in the first class match. It's, I look back with great fondness at those years, at being involved like that, and the people I met and the things that I did. And probably despite living in Australia for 40 years, I still have, sometimes it's a cross I bear, I still support the England Test team. Interestingly, so does my son, who was 6 months old when he came here, but he's inherited that from me. So we suffer together on occasions, but they're doing quite well at the moment. I remember, as you no doubt reasonably, the 2005 series in England, as many do, and also the 1981. But I remember 2005, I would come home from work every day on edge as to what was going to happen, usually whether the England batsmen were going to survive a bit more or something was going to go wrong. It was just so close to the line. And even in that final match when Peterson was batting to make the game safe, it wasn't clear until about tea time that things were not going to go wrong and England were too far ahead, even if there was a collapse, for anything to go wrong. And you remember these sort of knife-edge series. I suppose I remember them particularly because England won. The first year I was in Australia was the Packer era, and that was 1977, and Australia were out of sorts, but England probably won fair and square anyway. So these are the memorable ones, but there are certainly others. You probably remember, and I certainly remember, Australia and South Africa. In Australia, it would be sometime in the late 80s, early 90s, perhaps, when I think Australia won by 5 runs, but that was a knife-edge result. I was actually sitting in a church waiting to sing in a funeral, but we were telegraphing this fall of wickets to each other across from one side of the choir to another because it was just so gripping. And I'm looking forward to the Ashes in England. We get on very well here in Western Australia because with the time difference, it starts at 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening and goes through till 1 o'clock. So depending on how long suffering my wife is, we can watch it on television all evening. First of all, we get free-to-air coverage, which in England they haven't had for years. And we're better off than the eastern states of Australia, where there's a 3-hour time difference and it goes on till 4 o'clock in the morning. So we're very lucky in that regard. But I was going to say, we've had 2 tests over here against the West Indies, and they've both gone through the same fairly predictable course. Australia's made 500 plus. West Indies are out much more cheaply. Australia's declared, and then the West Indies have got rolled over. And it's such a shame, having seen the West Indies in their great days, that they're just not the side they used to be.